Enjoy.
First of all, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today while I present on salt-tolerant native plants for resilient coastal landscapes. I wanted to share that I have been for quite a few years now researching and trying to really find the best science-based information on salt-tolerant native plants and how here coastal Georgians can consider utilizing select plants, in particular for resiliency, for coastal landscapes that are being exposed to salt, water, or brackish environments. And I'll explain further about why this is really important for resiliency of our coastal communities and our ecosystem health. But this is not, at least at this point in time, a black and white science. Based on looking at different research papers and recent books that have been published, et cetera, and coming from different coastal areas, whether it's North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, or perhaps even Georgia, you may find different information from different resources on specific species. And therefore, I kind of just want to share before we get started that there may be a variance of different opinions regarding a particular species. And when you are considering this for your landscapes, some of it may be a little bit of an experiment, just like any gardening, landscaping ever is. And perhaps you'll want to really pay attention and letting nature kind of tell you how your selection is making it in the site conditions of your landscape. So the outline, I have so much to share, but so little time. So I'm going to be spending this lunch hour on coastal hazards, salt-tolerant native plant ecology, regarding species as well as native plant communities in the coast, and ultimately guidance on how to select native salt-tolerant plants for your landscape. So first, when we talk about coastal hazards in Georgia, several things come in mind. And one of the first we think about are hurricanes and big storms. And we are low lying, we're in low elevation here. And so that makes us particularly vulnerable to some of these weather-related challenges and hazards. And with these hurricanes and storms, as maybe many of you have experienced, we can get severe wind and tremendous rainfalls that ultimately cause flooding and storm surge, erosion, and increase of torrential stormwater runoff along our coastal areas. And when this happens, we see saltwater damage, and that occurs to our native plant communities. It can cause impacts to man-made ornamental landscapes, as well as human infrastructure. And storm intensity and the frequency of these storms and hurricanes, regretfully, researchers are predicting and scientists are predicting that's going to increase over the next century. So we have to really start thinking about the vulnerability of our coastal communities relative to these storm hazards and what kind of preventative measures we can take. Another hazard people tend to think about is the accelerating sea level rise. And regretfully, that is expected to increase over many years. Tidal levels are predicted to be roughly 3 to 8 feet above current levels by 2100. Another study determined that almost 420 square miles of the Georgia coast will sea level rise by 2110. And so these predictions are real, and potential impacts to our coastal landscapes are very much possible and real. And so we need to really look at how these rising water levels can potentially impair our coastal infrastructure and landscapes. And I wanted to just share the picture on the right. Many of you may be very familiar with Highway 80 heading to Tybee Island, where we have these king tides. And yes, over the years, the highway during those king tides may have been flooded somewhat, but as many of you are aware and experience, this is becoming more common day. And it's not just related to our high king tides, it's also related to what we're seeing of accelerating sea level rise. Another exception to this accelerating sea level rise is just how it's impacting our native plant communities. In that left-hand corner, you'll see an example of what is referred to as ghost force. When we have this accelerating sea level rise, we have inundation of the salt water into soils, which actually moves forward into forested areas, which eventually cause the failing of growth of new trees. And therefore, you see a lot of dead and dying trees as that salt water from sea level rise is furthering inland into those forested habitats. And this is not a picture of coastal Georgia. This is actually a picture of near where I grew up in Maryland. This is an Atlantic barrier island. It is something that obviously been very much habituated by human development. It was built on Fenwick Island. And what I wanted to point out here is when we think about native plants and native plant communities, on coastal areas, they provide tremendous ecosystem services to us as humans for free, but they need, in order for them to be resilient, and this would apply also to our own landscapes, there needs to be ability for native plant communities to ultimately retreat in response to sea level rise. And what happens is when you have human development, as such as you see in this picture, of Fenwick Island and Ocean City, Maryland, how are we to expect a native plant community to respond? And thus, when you have these extreme land conversions, we're losing those ecosystem services. And with the development, we're increasing impervious surfaces so that those roofs and those buildings and those roads and hard pavement areas are not allowing stormwater, flooding, as well as rainfall to infiltrate into the soils. And with that, you get increased and quite rapid volume of stormwater runoff, which once going toward a waterway will also collect contaminants and nutrients and sediments, which ultimately get into our lovely coastal waterways and create additional concerns. But we're lucky in coastal Georgia because we have some wonderful coastal native habitats. And there's quite a variety of them, as these four pictures share with you. We have salt and brackish habitats that have very different growing conditions. And when you think of coastal Georgia, you may think of the beaches and the dunes and the marshes, as well as maritime coastal forests. We also have both palustrine and estuarine wetlands that serve a very important role in flood retention and wildlife habitat and other things. But amongst these different varieties of our coastal Georgia habitats, you also get a variety of the salinity and the organic matter in soils and how much soil moisture there is in that particular habitat. So we can get from extremely wet to extremely very dry conditions. So what does that mean for a native plant that is found in coastal Georgia environments? Many people would say that these are quite extreme conditions for a native plant. Well, the native plants, they've adapted to these extreme and very distinct environmental conditions. And we have very dynamic physical forces that make it quite amazing to see how these native plants have evolved and adapted. We've got tides and currents and winds and storms and river outflows, which can be daily or more than daily events. And with that, we have different gradations of the salinity, the flooding, and temperatures that ultimately shape what kind of plant community composition we find in different areas of our coastal landscapes. So this is just an example of two types of coastal plant community profiles, one of a salt marsh and one of ocean beach. And basically, the ideal here is, for instance, if you look at the top of the profile of salt marsh, from the left, from the tidal creek, leading up and moving toward the maritime forest, you will see a change in the gradation of the salt spray or the inundation, the strong winds and high temperatures. What you'll see is once you get to that maritime forest, you will then have a canopy that ultimately is further removed from what you're seeing from the waterway itself. And that canopy will also provide shelter and some resilience to salt tolerance within the canopy structure and the under canopy plants. And a similar idea is with the ocean beach. If you look at the lower profile and you move from the right to the left, you will get that gradation change of less strong winds and potential for flooding and salt spray, et cetera. And this really makes practical sense. But it's something to keep in mind when you are assessing your own site and landscape in terms of where your landscape would fall relative to transitional maritime forest or that upland assessment versus where it is and how far it is from actual waterway conditions. So what does salt tolerant mean? Well, this is not a black and white answer, actually. I kind of formulated based on many different opinions of what all entails salt tolerance. And it really makes me even more aware and amazed at how native plants can evolve and adapt to these extreme conditions. So salt tolerance of a plant can relate to conditions of high winds, that carry the salt spray inland. And when they do that, they can leave salt deposits on the plants, which can have great impacts to individual plants depending on their tolerance levels. You have salt from spray that causes water to move out of the plants. And this is not good, especially on younger plants. The young leaves, they can result in burning, even the loss of leaves when you're dealing with non-salt tolerant plants. You can also have some damage from when you have real severe driving rains and frequently heavy surf. Now, coastal soils are quite unique in that they're generally high in soluble salts. They have an alkaline pH typically greater than 7. And what that means is you may have vital mineral nutrients that may be locked up that are needed for plant growth. So it may stymie the plant growth. And you may have sandy soils that just in general don't have much in terms of nutrients or water holding capacity. Other considerations include actual flooding of coastal soils with saline or brackish water. And those are from the storm surges or salt intrusion impacts, such as I list at the end. And the saltwater intrusion is impacting our freshwater aquifers, and that could have subsequent upward movements that impact our plant species. So we have, of course, many natural salt-tolerant plant landscapes that occur and habitats that occur here on the coast. But we also have many man-made landscapes that are built adjacent to the coastal habitats, such as perhaps yours. And this is where the salt exposure can really have impacts on damaging plants. You can have that water uptake interference browning of plants, even the killing of the plants. So when you have too much sodium with plants, you see wilting, slower growth, smaller leaves, perhaps death. And regretfully, we don't have any amendments that really can reduce salt levels in the soils. So the talk today is really about how you can choose to select native plants. And these are native plants that are specifically adapted to coastal shorelines and beaches, and they're naturally resistant to these salty conditions. And amazing enough, we have quite a few to choose from. A lovely thing about native plants in general, because they adapted to this crazy environment of the coast, when you use these native salt-tolerant plants to create or enhance your landscape, you're also improving the natural resiliency of the coastal hazards, how they respond to these hazards. And it also helps restore our local ecosystems, their ecological function and health and well-being. And in return, by doing that with our healthy ecosystems and helping to restore them, we as humans obtain those ecosystem services that nature provides us for free. The flood mitigation, the water quality, wildlife habitat, the protection we may have on the coasts, which ultimately, if we all bind together, can help reduce the size of disturbances and the destruction of human communities here in coastal Georgia. Now, when we talk about native plants and coastal native plants specifically, they are attuned to the sunlight, the extremes in temperatures, how much rainfall we get, the water regimes, how much salt's in the atmospheric air, and the soils. And they've also evolved over thousands of years to provide natural defenses to our native resident insects and diseases. But interesting enough, they can still provide food for herbivores like caterpillars and other herbivores that we want to encourage into our landscapes. And with these traits, once you've put them in the right site conditions of a landscape and have watered them and have established them, you'll find that they will thrive with minimal water use and no fertilizers or pesticides. And interesting enough, many of these salt-tolerant plants are unique in that they can grow in freshwater conditions as well. They can flourish in sites with those type of conditions, but they do best in sites with the elevated soil salts and the tides. So when we think about our own residence, our own home and landscape, one of the things you want to think about is how can our landscape support restoration of some of these native coastal habitats that are disappearing due to these challenges? What can we plant in our landscape to help support biodiversity and ultimately those ecosystem services that we depend on from these wonderful, healthy ecosystems? So our challenge is to think about designing and enhancing your landscape in whatever form it is, so that you can make it to be a functioning and healthy ecosystem that can be resilient to these salt challenges. Now, salt-tolerant plants, you want to be strategic how you place them. And you want to look at nature and examples of nature to figure out how you can emanate those habitats that can act as barriers to salt spray in your landscape itself. So whether you have all native plants, whether you have only ornamental plants, whether you have a mixture of the two, I strongly suggest you consider installing salt-tolerant native plants to serve as those buffers and those barriers to protect the more intolerant salt-tolerant plants you have in your landscape. So as you see on the right side picture, at the top, you'll see a barrier from a local tidal stream there. I don't know if you can see it to the extreme left of the picture, which is installed with salt-tolerant native plant grasses. And on the bottom part, it's kind of more of an example of if you live right along the marsh, whereby you can plant a variety of native plant habits to create what we call a marsh buffer zone nature curtain. That will ultimately provide that barrier to the salt spray in your further upland landscapes. This is another example of perhaps what you'd want to think about in design of how you can make your landscape ultimately more natural-based looking design versus on the right, you'll see you can very easily make salt-tolerant native plant landscapes appear very formal. And it's all depending on your choice, your selection, and your goals. Now, let's talk about site analysis. This is kind of like the hard work, but once you complete that, you're going to be in a much better position and situation to make the right selection of plants for your landscape, which ultimately will save you time, money, and just enjoyment of seeing the landscapes thrive. So a site analysis, why you do that? Well, you're trying to protect and restore coastal landscapes that we see are disappearing or being challenged by these coastal hazards. And we want to support the critical ecosystem services that they provide us that we depend upon. So you want to conduct an inventory, and you're looking at, okay, what are your current conditions there? And what do you have available as resources there versus what are some of the problems or constraints you have? And then when you dream and you think about what are the opportunities, what are the goals that you want to be considering in the design? But first we get into that fun, experimental and creative phase. I just want to point out that we are not talking today about efforts that involve very important protected natural resources, the wetlands, the high priority habitats. We are not talking about disturbing shorelines or marshes, rivers and streams, wetlands, et cetera. These particular habitats, if in any way you think you might even be having an impact with them, you would want to contact the Georgia DNR Coastal Resources Division and the local permit coordinator just to share with them, to tell them what you're planning to do, to see if for any reason you would have to have someone look at what you're doing and see if you need a necessary permit. So back to the site analysis. This is kind of the fun part where you go out on your landscaping and you basically read the landscape. Look out there, see what you're saying, assess it. Identify, well, what kind of habitat already is existing on the site? If you're lucky enough to have some native habitat, what kind is it? Are you talking about being adjacent to a marsh? Are you talking about being adjacent to beaches? Are you talking about being on a berry island that could be exposed to either or? So these are things that you first want to assess and address. Then you want to look at your site a little bit more in detail. And you can do this very simply, as I show an example on the right. You could do this on the back of an envelope if you wanted to, where you just really kind of draw out your land, your landscape, and you can use Google Earth or other methods to do this. But you wanted to determine what's the sunlight, moisture, soil types, what are the conditions of the site? Where's the sunrise? Where does it sunset? What are the seasonal changes relative to full sun versus partial sun exposure versus shade? And make note of that. Make note of your lawn and what area of the turf that you feel is really important to retain, or maybe you no longer need this area of the turf and you want to add some additional native plant beds that perhaps have that salt exposure tendencies. And then you try as best as you can, look at what vegetation you have. what native vegetation you have, what non-native ornamental vegetation you have, and hopefully no invasive species. But this is very, very important for the well-being of our ecosystem health and our coastal communities. I provide on the left examples of 4 somewhat pretty prolific and invasive plants that do occur here on the coast. We're very lucky because we have some wonderful invasive species resources. If you're not sure about this, we have the Coastal Georgia Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, and that's their website, as well as the Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council. You may also want to seek out your county extension officer agents with UGA to see if they may be able to assist you in this effort. But identifying and eliminating invasive species is paramount to any well-being of any landscape here on the coast. So the next thing, again, this is an example of a more complex effort by an individual where the person ID'd what of their site, what of their landscape they really liked, what things they didn't like, what things they saw as real problems and challenges and liabilities, and what they want to change. So this is kind of where it can seem very overwhelming. I just, based on my own experience, would suggest that you do this in phases, maybe 1 phase a year or whatever, where you just slowly really concentrate on one area of your landscape, analyze it well, figure out how you use it, how you want to use it, the vegetation existing, what needs to go, and what can be installed. And then, of course, throughout the whole time, you can be assessing what wildlife you have. And the presence of different species of wildlife may help you determine what you may want to keep, what you may want to enhance, or what you may want to install as well. So one of the examples I use is on the lower left-hand corner with the monarchs. As you see, they are quite profuse on a very common salt-tolerant shrub that we have that you tend to see along the causeways in the end of October, November, when they're just wowing you with their prolific flowers and seed heads. Groundsel, Baccharis helmifolia. Throughout the year, it's pretty nondescript. People don't tend to notice it. In the late fall, it's profuse, and the beauty of it's quite profound. And more importantly, it has been determined to be a very important plant for late migrating monarchs that are heading down to Mexico. So this is just an example of kind of looking at the wildlife, kind of looking at what plants are available and determining what you may want to keep, what you want to be changing. Sometimes maybe you may want to choose to keep a native plant that you may have said, like to put something else in there, but the wildlife value may be enough to keep it in. And then ultimately, you're looking at what are the native plants that you want to plant and consider for the site conditions. So let's get into that just a little bit more. So how do we go about selecting those native plants? Here we go. First of all, if you live near any natural coastal habitats, go and seek them out, enjoy them, observe them, take pictures, and note what native plants are existing there. Because many native plants are already grown on these coastal lands. They're highly salt tolerant, and maybe they're the appropriate ones to be considering to be incorporated into your landscape. So if you're lucky enough to live near a natural area, it's a wonderful thing if you could pick native plants that complement those natural areas and enhance those areas as well. And perhaps provide even a corridor that expands the value to wildlife in the area. There's a wonderful book called The Natural Communities of Georgia. It's big, it's a hardback book, quite extensive. It's a tremendous publication. Regretfully, it is somewhat expensive, but it provides characteristic native plant lists characteristic native plants that are occurring in specific native plant communities of Georgia. So when you look at coastal plain or maritime communities of Georgia in the book, they will provide you specific characteristic native plants that occur within those native communities. If for any reason you can't locate that, you can't purchase it, you can't locate that in the library, please feel free to contact me and I'll see if I can help you out with the characteristic plant list. It's a wonderful way to start thinking about what you want to plant in your landscape based on the natural areas adjacent to you. And of course, with salt-tolerant plants, your main goal, you want to get it right for your site conditions. So you want to look at those plants that are right for the habitats and buffers that you are dealing with related to wind, salt, inundation, and let your site condition drive how salt tolerant you believe your plants need to be. And of course, you want to put your placement of your vegetation based on how the water zones, the hydric zones, and the salt tolerant zones. You don't want to, for instance, plant a high water need plant in with a very low drought tolerant plant. Keep all those things in mind when you're trying to determine your plants and their locations. And one thing I did want to point out relative to hurricanes and big storms that we have here, perhaps some of you all have seen or regretfully experienced situations where you've had down vegetation due to these hazards. And so there is something called hurricane suitability related to trees, native trees, and also some non-native trees. And there's a range of high hurricane suitability, high wind resistant trees to all the way to low. And I just wanted to provide an example of high versus low. They're also medium species that have been determined, and this is based on two separate scientific efforts, one in South Carolina, the other in Florida, where if you have lost trees and you want to replace some trees, native trees, depending on where they're located, and if you're concerned about hurricane and storm winds, you may want to look at the high wind resistant trees for consideration in your planting and make sure that individual species appropriately fits your site conditions in other ways. But this is something where you again get into the gray areas. Like for example, if you look down on the right under low, you'll see, for instance, wax myrtle, where one site, one of the research sources said it was of low wind resistance, whereas another resource said it's medium to low. So once again, you have to kind of really research and think it through and take this important information, scientific-based information to heart when you're selecting a tree. So this is a variety, and this is something I'm going to go through quickly. This just provides a variety of some of the wonderful native plant species that we have here that thrive here in the coast and can thrive in different variations of salt-tolerant landscapes. So first I'm going to start out with perennials. And as you can see, I first started with one that has quite low salt tolerance, which is a ground cover partridge berry. But as you can see of the others, we have high to low variations in their tolerance, which would determine and help you determine what's appropriate based on their exposures to salt or brackish waters. Here's some more. Just lovely plants, lovely colors, lovely textures and forms. And some of these plants just grow so well and so easily. Examples are the seaside goldenrod, the dune or cumberleaf sunflower, Gilardia blancaflower, very easy to grow. Here are some examples of vines. None of these vines are of high salt tolerance, but it is quite interesting to see that there is some salt tolerant resistance on these plants. And then grasses. I understand someone was very interested in grasses. I have several slides here. We are blessed with some beautiful native grasses here. And these particular are the salt-tolerant grasses. And as you'll see, there's a variation of some that are moderate salt tolerant, some are low, some just really depending on the conditions of your site. And for instance, you really want to look at the uniqueness of each individual, their mature size and height, what kind of structure and texture you're looking at, what additional vegetation do you have or plan to have adjacent to them to provide more of a, whether it's a natural look or perhaps a more formal look. The switchgrass in the lower left-hand corner, Panicum virgatum, that has been used in extremely formal salt-tolerant landscapes. It's just very unique, very tall plant that keeps very upright, very formal looking, and it is beautiful. So it just really depends on your goals and what you want your landscape to look at. And wow, look at some of the colors that we have here. Now I do want to point out the bottom left and the bottom right. We have two very similar species, Muhlenbergia genus, and the one on the left, Philippines, that is very specifically found in beachfront, dune, and coastal wetland areas, the immediate coastal, along the coastal waterways there. This is what's been used for sweetgrass baskets. But on the right is what you probably are more familiar with. This is Muhlenbergia capillaris. And this is quite variable. It can grow in drier conditions, but it's also salt tolerant. So sometimes you really need to pay attention to the actual species to make sure you're selecting the right grass or right plant. And here are some additional options as well. And here we go. Very quickly, I'm going to go through shrubs and small trees. Just gorgeous variety and color, texture. You want to always think of the mature height, size, and width. The kuntis on that lower right, oh, I just love them. They're around with the dinosaurs. They can live 150 or more years, and they are extremely salt tolerant. Here's some more. I'm hoping many of these look very familiar to you. So you can look at winter interest in berries, fall coverage, what height, what texture, the colors of the floral blooms, the berries. Just beautiful opportunities here. Lovely opportunities. And very quickly, I'm hoping that a publication that I've written with a former PhD candidate at UGA, Dr. Rachel Smith, expected out perhaps in fall 2021. This is going to be a very comprehensive guidance document with many native salt-tolerant species lists, as well as coastal native plant communities and those correct characteristic species I mentioned before. So that will be out hopefully in the fall and will serve as more extensive science-based guidance in selecting these salt-tolerant landscape plants. But before that, I also want to bring up the fact that we have our UGA EcoScapes native plant search engine, where you can choose under the conservation landscaping options in the middle, you can choose salt tolerant. And once you provide the information of your county and very specific information on your site conditions, then you select salt tolerant, you will ultimately get a list of species that fall within those choices you selected. And if you're not familiar with those species, you can select either the common or scientific name of the individual species, which will direct you to another page with photos and more information on the species. So that may help assist you in trying to just start querying what may be appropriate for your site conditions. When you purchase your plants, you want to keep in mind that we are, as circled on the right, within the Georgia ecoregion called the Southern Coastal Plain. And when you're buying plants, you are ideally trying to purchase plants that come from that southern coastal plain. And that could mean from Georgia, South Carolina, or even Florida. If possible, if you can't find it from the southern coastal plain, try to at least limit your purchases to the broader coastal plain ecoregion, because although that species may occur in the Piedmont or the mountainous ecoregions, individual plants have evolved differently in those particular conditions of the climates and regimes of those ecoregions. And we want to make sure that you purchase a native plant that will thrive in the conditions in the coastal plain. And here's just a list of just a few of the EcoScapes webpage resources that you may find of assistance. One's really about just shopping and gardening with native plants. And second one's about the nursery sources available in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coastal plain. How do you kind of go about, how do you prepare to go to a nursery to possibly purchase native plants, et cetera. And then there's more information on the native plant search engine I just provided to you, as well as a guidance document that can provide you step-to-step resources for how to use it. And now I'm here for any questions you may have. Thank you so much for providing your time during your precious lunch hour and sharing it with us.
Well, thank you so much, Keren, for all of that information. We'll give folks a few minutes. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And I know that someone at the beginning was really interested in salt-tolerant grasses. So if you have any follow-up specific questions about those grasses, please feel free to add them here.
Yeah, let me.
Oh, so someone did ask, what is a salt-tolerant lawn grass?
What is a species, a long grass, L-O-N-G, you mean?
Lawn, L-A-W-N.
Oh, salt tolerant, not turfs. Oh, I'm not a turf expert by any means, so I'm not sure about that. But I could be wrong. But I believe the St. Augustine grass has salt tolerant and drought tolerant tendencies.
Wonderful, thank you, Keren. Any other questions from the audience? Keren, are there salt-tolerant plants that people can view in the EcoScapes demonstration garden currently?
Yes, if you all aren't aware of it, we do have a demonstration garden down here at Brunswick at our Brunswick facility. It's actually undergoing some changes right now in the different beds, but we provide a salt-tolerant native plant bed. We have a drought-tolerant native plant bed. We have pollinator beds. We're installing a new rain garden bed, et cetera. So a lot to see and behold. I would say wait a little bit to come because we are having some things extracted from the garden right now, and we're going to be busy planting some of these beds in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But would love to have you join us. Some of the salt-tolerant plants I'm excited to say is I've seen with some of the most recent native plant nurseries that occur in this area, the retail nurseries, that some of them are really starting to share some wonderful salt-tolerant plants that aren't typically found in the nursery trade. So one thing you may want to do, because the sourcing of native plants here is regretfully a challenge, is get a hold of that one EcoScapes resource that I mentioned that's in the slide regarding the actual nursery sources, and look up the information for the individual nurserymen. They're all wonderful and very much willing to help you out. And see what native plants are actually available currently. And that may help you determine what plants you want to install within your landscape at this point in time.
Awesome. Thanks, Keren. And we had a couple more questions and comments from the group. So two specific plants that people are wondering if they're salt tolerant are muhly grass and camellias.
Yeah, okay. Now, camellia is a non-native plant, and I'm not an ornamental expert. And I'm just trying to think of where I've seen camellias are just beautiful. And I'm trying to think if I've seen them anywhere in what might be more salt tolerant exposure areas. And I just currently can't see that. If they want to share their email or something, I would be happy to look that up for them and send that information on the camellias. But I did want to bring up, I don't know if you still see the slides or not. Do they still see slides currently? No?
They do, yes.
Okay. On this one slide, I'm sharing at the bottom too, I mentioned before the muhly grasses. These are the two muhly grasses that do occur here in the coast. And so you'll see the Gulf Falls muhly on the left. This is one that truly is right there up against the waterway, okay? And this is not easy to source. It's more for restoration purposes. The other muhly that I think you were asking about that's more likely that you've seen is the one on the right, the Heron muhly, Muhlenbergia capillaris. As you see, it has high to moderate salt tolerance. So it is truly a wonderful plant for salt tolerant landscape. And the interesting thing is it's salt tolerant, but it can even thrive in drier conditions if you'd like.
That's awesome. And we also had a number of people that were sharing kind of their experience with what has worked in their own landscapes. So one thing was mentioned was that someone's had terrific luck with bottle brush. And then someone else mentioned that seashore paspalum is so salt tolerant we could rock salt to control weeds. And that one was actually developed at UGA, but is sold currently mostly in Florida.
That is so true. Thank you for sharing that. And some of those species are shared in the broader and the more comprehensive guidance document. But thank you for sharing that. It's wonderful to hear.
Yes, thank you to our participants that have added that. And we do have time for one or two more questions. So if anyone has any remaining questions or things that you found that have worked really well in your landscape, you can add those to the chat or the Q&A. And I know at the beginning, it seemed like so many of our participants had experienced saltwater exposure or salt exposure. And I'm curious if you can add in the chat if you've mostly had that from the air or the soil or flooding, any saltwater intrusion, if you know kind of how the salt is getting to your plants at your particular site.
It'd be very interesting to know some of it was really from flooding, from the hurricanes, the storm surges, versus are you more in just a situational landscape where you commonly receive salt spray and may increase during a storm event? That kind of information can be very helpful to know.
So we are getting some responses. So someone lives right on the eastern marsh and have brackish flooding, as well as saltwater intrusion, which made the well too salty to use on the lawn. And then other folks have experienced storm surge from hurricanes. So are there, Keren, do you have suggestions for plants that can withstand stormwater or from hurricane surge?
Yes, a lot of these plants, and if they want to email me, I didn't want to get into details of what plant is tolerant for this different type of condition, but the aspect of inundation, which plants actually can tolerate and thrive in flooding conditions, I can provide a list for that person. And when you have a situation where you're on the marsh area and you have that marsh barrier there, one of the easiest ways to really deal with some of the flooding is to just enhance that marsh buffer with grasses and and other plants that can be beautiful, won't impede your visual line that you want to see of the water and the beautiful habitat, but it'll not only provide and enhance your site, it'll decrease the amount of turf, so you don't have to use the money on that, in terms of watering or chemicals and things like that could get in the waterways. And it also provides further wildlife habitat and beautiful fall and winter color.
Well, thanks again, Keren. And it does sound like there's a lot of details to take in consideration for your particular site. So if you do have additional questions for your landscape, the link that we put into the EcoScapes webpage does have Keren's contact information, so you can let her know specific questions, and we'll follow up this program within a week or so with the handout of this PowerPoint and some of those follow-up questions that were asked. And
Kayla, can I just throw in, if people are asked about individual landscapes, sometimes photos can speak 1,000 words. So if anybody has the opportunity to take some very specific photos that may help me in trying to determine how to best answer their questions, I greatly appreciate it.
Well, that's wonderful. Thanks for that tip, Keren. And if you're interested in other kinds of native plant landscaping, Keren will be teaching another class on May 24th. This one will be on drought tolerant landscaping with native plants. And that's a great one for adults. Another great upcoming virtual event for adults is our Soar, Sing, Fly with World Migratory Bird Day on May 7th. So we'll be focusing on shorebirds that are visiting Georgia this time of year, but how that ties into more global migration patterns and what we can do to help protect them. And then we have a number of family virtual programs, including one on sharks and rays. Next Monday, April 26th from 4 to 5 p.m. We've got one on alligators for families a little bit later in that week, and one about burrfish the first week of May. And you can find all of that on our event page, which I will put into the chat right now. And then this webinar does count for the Coastal Stewards program as hours towards that. I recognize a number of your names from having come to a lot of our Coastal Stewards programs. So we do also have some in-person small group events that you can take part in that count towards Coastal Stewards, which is a program for adults on environmental education designed specifically around coastal stewardship. And if you go onto that event page, you'll see which ones count towards Coastal Stewards. But we do have some forest hikes in April that count, as well as some boat trips as well. And a big thank you to all of our friends that are listening, as your support has really allowed us to keep doing education work on the coast. And if you're interested in becoming a friend, you can find that on our website as well. So with that, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and good luck if you decide to plant some native plants. And feel free to reach out if you have questions.